you very much. Thank you for inviting us to participate in this workshop. And as Robert said, this is co-authored with Vanessa Alvarez, Chen Nitya Pandalai Nair, Liliana Varela, and Hongyang Chan. So let me start with a motivation. A key feature of globalization over the past half century, of course, has been the enormous increase in FDI flows across countries. And so what that's meant is just an increasing importance of multinational firms in employment and production, and in changes in employment and production in both home and host countries. And so this naturally raises the question of the role of multinationals in structural change, and especially regarding the feature of structural change involving the hump-shaped pattern in the manufacturing employment share as countries develop over time. And in particular, you have the upward part of the hump that involves middle income or fast-growing countries, and then the downward part of the hump involving more advanced or slow-growing countries. So a simple metaphor for what might be happening in the last couple decades is one where a multinational parent in an advanced economy sources production abroad and maybe an emerging market country, and that has obvious consequences for employment, and you might think that could be contributing to the hump pattern in manufacturing. So that's the question we want to address, is kind of an integrated, systematic examination of the role of multinationals in structural change. And by integrated, I mean we want to look at inward FDI or recipient FDI countries as well as outward FDI countries. And we want to also do an empirical and theoretical examination. And for today, we just have some preliminary findings, and we're going to present two things: an accounting decomposition of the role of multinationals in the change in the manufacturing employment share in 5 countries. And obviously to do this, you need micro data. And for most of the countries, we have access to census data or the population of firms. And then second, we're going to present a simple model of multinationals and trade and structural change, and just do a couple of simple exercises to study the effect of liberalization of multinational activity and also of a productivity increase in the manufacturing sector of the recipient FDI country. So that's the broad overview. And before I go to the accounting decomposition, I just want to introduce the 5 countries and show a couple of facts about these countries. So our countries are Hungary, China, Japan, France, and the United States. And this is a picture from the GGDC and the OECD of the manufacturing employment share from roughly 1990 to 2010. And you see 3 kind of patterns across these countries. In Hungary, you see basically like a mini hump pattern during this period. In China, you see a big increase in the manufacturing employment share after 2000. And then, of course, in Japan, France, and the United States, they've been on the declining part of the manufacturing hump for several decades, and you see a pretty steady decline in the employment shares during this period. So what about the importance of multinationals in manufacturing employment in these countries? So this is a table that shows that, but before I go further, I should mention that what we're identifying as multinational employment in China and Hungary is very different from the way we're doing it in the US, Japan, and France. So in China and Hungary, we're counting multinational employment as employment by affiliates of, from the perspective of China and Hungary, foreign multinationals. So just as an example, a General Motors, the employment at a General Motors affiliate in China. That's what we're counting. But in the United States, Japan, and France, we're counting the employment by the multinational parent. So it would be the General Motors parent in the United States would be the multinational employment for the United States. So that's going to be the way we're going to, as I said, count MNC employment. We're making this distinction between China and Hungary on the one hand, and the US, Japan, and France on the other hand. And this is going to carry through in both our accounting decomposition and in our model. So what this table shows is that in China and Hungary, comparing like the 1990s to a more recent year, there's just been a big increase in the MNC share of manufacturing employment, tripling in China and doubling in Hungary, and reaching almost 50% of manufacturing employment in 2010. By contrast, in the US, Japan, and France, the manufacturing employment share of MNCs has been basically stable or declining, as in the case of the United States, where it declined by 4 percentage points between 1993 and 2011. So that was just some background information. Now let me talk about the accounting decomposition. And as I mentioned earlier, ideally you would like census or population data to get a more accurate calculation of the role of MNCs in structural change. We actually have access to census data for all 5 countries, but for the calculations we did today, we use the census data for the United States, Hungary, and France, and then survey data for China and Japan. And the accounting methodology we use is the Foster, Halter-Wanger, Krizan methodology. And basically, we're going to decompose the change in the manufacturing employment share of total employment over time into a contribution of multinationals and non-multinationals. And then we're also going to decompose the multinational contribution into a contribution of continuing firms, which basically encompasses within and between and covariance effects, and then also contributions of entering and exiting firms. So that's, so let me now just turn to the results of our accounting decomposition, and that's given in this table. So this table has 2 panels, the left and the right panel. The left panel, or panel A, just gives the breakout of the change in the manufacturing employment share into a multinational contribution and a non-multinational contribution. And then the right panel decomposes the multinational contribution into those 3 terms I mentioned, the contribution of continuing firms, entering firms, and exiting firms. And then we also break out the time periods into an earlier period, which is roughly the 1990s, except for France, which is just the first decade of the 2000s, and then a later period, which for all of the countries except France is the 2000s. In France, it's the 2010s. So I just want to call your attention to the numbers in red. You can see in the earlier period in Hungary and in the United States, multinationals are accounting for 80% of the increase in the manufacturing employment share in Hungary and 80% of the decrease in the manufacturing employment share in the United States. And they also account for a fairly significant role in the decline of the manufacturing employment share in Japan and France, but not as large as in the United States. Then turning to the 2000s, looking at China, perhaps not surprisingly, the role of multinational affiliates in China, that's accounting for the majority of the increase in manufacturing employment in China. And then for the United States, you see that multinational parents continue to account for a majority of the decline in the manufacturing employment share there. But you can also see in Japan and France that multinationals do not play a significant role, quantitatively significant role in the decline, in the continuing decline of their manufacturing employment share. So there's no kind of universal pattern, either in the recipient countries or in the outward FDI countries. To summarize the right panel, I would say the broad theme is that in China and Hungary, the importance of entering firms is relatively greater than in the US, Japan, and France. In the US, Japan, and France, continuing firms and exiting firms are relatively more important. So that kind of scratches the surface of what we've done with our micro data, but I think it does point to, you know, in our countries, there are clearly long periods of time where multinationals are accounting for a large share of either the increase or the decrease in the manufacturing employment shares. So now let me turn to the model that we're going to work with, and it's basically an extension of the Helpman-Melitz-Yapel multinational model to multiple sectors, and we're going to have 3 sectors: agriculture, manufacturing, and services. And so, you know, as is characteristic with the Melitz model, and as in the paper we just saw by Alexandra Peters, the firms are going to draw a productivity, and based on that draw, they're going to decide whether to produce or not. And then if they choose to produce, they're going to decide whether to serve the foreign market. And if they're going to serve the foreign market, they need to decide whether they're going to export or serve via a multinational. And we have several frictions in the framework: fixed cost of production, exporting multinational activity, and also variable cost of exporting and multinational activity. We're going to set up our exercises so that China has a comparative advantage in manufacturing. And so with this framework, we're just going to look at 2 scenarios involving China's manufacturing sector. We're going to lower the variable cost of multinat production in China, and so we're going to consider this a multinat liberalization. And then we're also going to look at the effect of a productivity increase in China's manufacturing sector. So we're, unlike in the previous paper, which was a serious quantitative exercise, here we're just doing what I'm going to call an illustrative, qualitative, numerical exercise. And so let me turn to that now. So this is a table of some of the effects of this multinational liberalization in China. And again, I want to focus on the numbers in red, and starting on the left, which just gives the % change in employment. You see that in China, manufacturing employment increases. In the United States, it decreases. And then also in the US, services employment increases. So what's going on here? So now I want to shift to the numbers in the 2 right columns. And starting with China, you see that multinat employment increases in China, and that's the 9.5 number. So basically, of course, with the multinat liberalization, US firms are now sourcing production in China, and so employment at affiliates, at China's affiliates of US multinats increases. But at the same time that's happening, that's going to crowd out Chinese, domestic non-multinat firms in China. So there's going to be a partial offset of declining employment in the manufacturing sector in China, and that's the negative 6.7 number. But when you add the 2 numbers together, you get an increase in manufacturing employment there. Turning to the United States, you'll see that employment in both the MNC firms and the non-MNC firms declines. So to understand what's going on here, just think of the basic Melitz model. You've got a bunch of exporters initially, and the way we set up this model, there is no multinat activity in the initial equilibrium. So then you do this multinational liberalization. So the most productive exporters are basically choosing to become multinationals. So in the process of becoming multinationals, they no longer need to employ the workers who are involved in export production. And so that's why employment in those firms declines, and that's the negative 1.1 number. And so that covers kind of the right tail of the exporters, but then there's also the left tail of exporters. Before they were exporting to China, but now the market in China has become a lot more competitive, and it's partly because of these multinats that have set up shop in China. You've got these really productive US firms now using inexpensive labor in China. That's making it more competitive for the weaker exporters to China. So bottom line is the cutoff for exporting to China increases. So a bunch of these weaker exporters get out of that market, and they can only serve the U.S. Market, and so the employment goes down there. So that basically describes what happens in the U.S. and China. In the interest of time, I'm going to just spend like 30 seconds on the combining the previous exercise with this productivity increase in manufacturing in China. And basically the effects of this productivity increase, they reinforce the multinational liberalization in terms of the effects on manufacturing employment in China. So let me just move towards wrapping up, and by referring to one more exercise that we did, which was to repeat the multinational liberalization, but do it with a higher trade cost than in our baseline exercise. And the results there are given in the lower table. And let me call your attention first to the 10.2 number, this number in red on the far right. So there you see that multinational employment in China, the employment of China's affiliates of US multinats, that increases by more than in the baseline case. And this is just your standard tariff jumping multinational activity going on. But at the same time, of course, there's more crowding out activity of non-MNC Chinese firms. And so the decline in employment from there is actually larger. So the net increase in manufacturing employment in China under high trade costs, when you have this multinational liberalization, is actually smaller than the net increase in manufacturing employment in our baseline liberalization with lower trade costs. So to summarize, basically, there's this complementarity between a multinat liberalization and lower trade costs in terms of their effects on manufacturing employment in China. So, so that's basically it. To wrap up, you know, we have this kind of ambitious agenda of what we want to do in terms of studying the role of multinationals in structural change, both empirically and theoretically, and with recipient countries and outward FDI countries. And so far, we've just scratched the surface. In terms of future work, we want to develop testable implications from the model that we can take to the data econometrically, and then also do a quantitative exercise similar in spirit to the previous paper. So thank you.
Thank you, Kei-Mu, for this interesting look at these data and this model. So who wants to open the discussion? Luis?
Hey, thanks, Doc. So quick question. So when one thinks about multinationals, well, the first thing that comes to my mind is global value chains. So I want, and at some point the net effect can be, and it is, for instance, if you compare US and China, well beyond manufacturing. So I wonder if there's any way that you can follow employment effects of these flows outside manufacturing. Think about, yes, there's much more Apple products produced in China, but all the design has been boosted here in the US. So I wonder if you can trace those to see if there's an effect also in services through the multinational.
Okay, let's collect a few. Joe? Joe, you had a question?
I was curious. Yeah, sorry. I was curious. The decomposition, Kei-Mu, I was, first of all, very interesting paper, and I was surprised because it's kind of a populist interpretation of things. But do we know, is the decline, for example, in the United States disproportionate in multinationals, or is it just that multinationals constitute such a large share of manufacturing employment in the United States. That's the first thing. The second thing is, can you map the actual multinationals to see whether it's the multinational moving production abroad? And then the third thing is, we know from high frequency data that like the job destruction in manufacturing is concentrated in recessions. And do you see the same thing with the multinational activity, or is that largely acyclical?
Thank you. Who else wants to join in? All right, Kei-Mu, if you want to answer these, and maybe we'll pick up some additional questions after.
Yes, thanks to Luis and Joe for your questions. So I'll do the best I can, and then I think I have some co-authors on, and it would be great if they had an opportunity to respond as well. With the global value chains, absolutely, I agree. And let me take this opportunity to mention that that final result I showed on the complementarity, you know, the model, the framework we have is actually just a horizontal FDI model, and yet we still got that. There's no export platforms or global value chains, and yet we still got that complementarity result. So we thought that was kind of nice. And obviously, at least on the modeling side, going forward, I think we want to allow for some export platform behavior, which I think was critical in both Hungary and China. In terms of the data, I'm going to delegate that to my co-authors about tracing, for example, as you said, the Apple example. I don't know personally the answer to that. Let me just turn briefly to Joe's question. The decline is disproportionate to the multinational share. So it's an outsized, it's greater than their share of the economy or their share of employment. And again, in terms of mapping, you know, can we actually see in the data the specific movement of employment from a parent in the US to like an affiliate abroad? I'll leave that to one of my co-authors. And then in terms of the behavior over business cycles, again, I don't know the answer to that, but I do think that's an interesting question, and I'll also leave that to hopefully one of our co-authors.
Okay, who of the team wants to take the floor?
So I can answer some of the, I mean, it's not exactly going to answer each specific question, but I can explain some of the things about the US data very briefly, and Vanessa can also chime in. So in previous work, I found that on average, in terms of manufacturing employment shares, multinationals were about 40% of US manufacturing employment. Can I trace, and we've also shown that, you know, they were responsible for quite a significant decline in US manufacturing employment. And Vanessa has related work on this. We do know which countries the multinationals are from in the US data, and we can observe what happens to their manufacturing employment and their services employment in the US, but we cannot trace exactly the loss of a manufacturing job in the US to the gain of one in a foreign country, because we typically, and this is a problem with all microdata, it cannot be linked across countries, and so we can in general not look at the same firm in two different countries. We cannot identify them. There are no common identifiers in two different countries microdata. That is always going to be an issue with microdata in general. Because of confidentiality, we are not allowed to link it across countries. Vanessa, do you want to add something?
Thank you, Nitya. Thank you, Kei-Mu. I think that it's very similar to what Nitya says. I think that just to add up in terms of the US data, in US data, the foreign affiliates are an important chunk of the overall employment, but even more so, local multinationals within the US. And this is a distinction that we are able to do across the different data sets, which I think is an important one, is what is the role of local multinationals in the country versus the role of foreign affiliates in that country. And because these patterns are quite different across countries. Most of the responsibility of the declining in employment in the US is going to be driven by local multinationals in the US, whereas in China, the increase in employment is going to come from foreign affiliates acting in the US. And in terms of like the linkages, I think the data is very powerful in the sense like none of these exercises of disentangle what is coming from multinationals versus not will be not possible if we don't have this micro data that is able to distinguish by ownership type. And so I think that this is like a important feature that we want to highlight. At the same time, we cannot link this through the different countries. So with Orbis, we could be able to check what are the foreign parents, let's say, of these affiliates that are acting in the US. But unfortunately, we're not going to be able to see the detail of what is going on in each of the plants that, let's say, are operating in China. So, and I agree, a lot of this is vertical. Right now, the model is treating this as an horizontal exercise. And as Kei-Mu said, I think that later we are going to try, at least model-wise, to capture this through export platforms feature. That's it, unless there is more questions. Thank you.
So let me add 2 more points. Sorry. So relate to,
if you could.
Oh, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah. No, but briefly, if you could.
Okay. So for Louis' question, we actually have this kind of supply chain like thing because the like fixed cost of doing MNC activities are treated as service jobs, and we also try to incorporate kind of the multinational in China borrow service jobs, basically use service jobs in the US and manufacturing jobs in China to produce outputs, and that's going to kind of generate a bigger impact on the service employment increase in the US. So for Joe's question, actually, in the Japanese data, like the multinet data, like the USB equivalent USB data, you can observe both parent and affiliate employment actually by category, like menu and services jobs. So we are kind of thinking doing kind of this cross-country regression exercises by looking at how like opening of a manufacturing affiliate or increasing foreign manufacturing employment in the affiliates. How does that affect your parent firm's manufacturing and service jobs? Yeah, we can talk more definitely.